Washington State wildlife biologist recently walked away from his 20-year career. The reason, according to documents he shared with me, a disagreement over thermal footage he captured during an official elk survey, footage showing something walking upright that he couldn't identify. His supervisor reportedly asked him to reclassify the observation. He declined, and his contract wasn't renewed. I've obtained that footage, and when I showed it to 3 independent wildlife experts, none of them could explain what they were seeing. But here's what caught my attention. This isn't an isolated incident. I've documented over 40 similar cases where wildlife professionals reported encounters with large bipedal animals and faced professional complications afterward. I'm Dr. Jonathan Mitchell, PhD wildlife biologist, and for 20 years I've been quietly collecting evidence that rarely makes it into public view. Official reports filed through government channels, thermal imaging from agency surveys, testimony from forest rangers who requested anonymity. Today I'm sharing what that investigation has revealed, including why a viral Bigfoot video with 23 million views appears to be a carefully staged hoax that generated over $200,000, and why some of the most compelling evidence comes from sources you'd never expect. By the end of this video, you'll understand why many wildlife professionals are reluctant to discuss unexplained observations publicly. Let's start by examining that viral video. 2019. A video appears on YouTube, posted by an anonymous account with no posting history. Within 72 hours, it accumulates 23 million views. Major news outlets cover it. Social media explodes with shares. Bigfoot researchers immediately begin debating its authenticity. The footage shows a large creature, approximately 7 to 8 feet tall, walking through what's described as a Northern California forest in afternoon sunlight. What made this video different from typical Bigfoot footage? The camera work is remarkably stable. Not the usual shaky handheld you'd expect from someone who just spotted something extraordinary. The subject stays perfectly centered in frame throughout the entire sequence. The lighting is professional quality, almost cinematic. Then something happens that convinced millions of viewers this was genuine. The creature stops walking mid-stride, slowly turns its head toward the camera, appears to make deliberate eye contact for approximately 3 seconds, then casually continues walking into the tree line. It looked dramatic. It looked compelling. It looked exactly like what people wanted to see. The video went massively viral. Comments flooded in. This is finally proof. This is the clearest footage ever captured. Mainstream science needs to take this seriously. Then, approximately 2 weeks after the video reached peak viral status, something interesting happened. A Patreon page appeared. Same anonymous account, focused on Bigfoot investigation and research. According to publicly available Patreon data and social media discussions, the page generated substantial revenue. Some estimates suggested over $200,000 in the first year. This timing raised questions in my mind, so I decided to have the footage analyzed professionally by experts with no connection to the Bigfoot research community, people who had no stake in whether it was real or fake, just objective analysis. What the experts found: I contacted Dr. Sarah Chen, a wildlife behaviorist with 18 years documenting primate behavior in field conditions. She spent extended periods observing gorillas in Central Africa, chimpanzees in East Africa, and orangutans in Southeast Asia. Her work focuses specifically on how wild primates respond to unexpected stimuli, including human encounters. When I showed her the viral footage, her assessment was immediate and unambiguous. The behavior doesn't match any documented wild primate response to unexpected human encounters in the scientific literature. She explained to me that in her nearly 2 decades of field research studying great ape, she's documented hundreds of surprise encounters between wild primates and humans. The responses fall into 2 extremely consistent categories. Immediate flight response: the animal runs at maximum speed away from the perceived threat. Or complete freeze response: the animal becomes absolutely motionless, attempting to avoid detection through stillness. What she has never observed, not once in 18 years across 3 continents, is a wild primate slowly turning toward an unexpected human presence, making sustained eye contact, holding that gaze for multiple seconds, and then casually walking away at a leisurely pace. According to Dr. Chen, that behavioral sequence is inconsistent with wild animal threat assessment. It's more consistent with what you might see from a trained performer who knows they're being filmed. I then sent the footage to Dr. Marcus Thompson, who specializes in primate biomechanics and locomotion analysis. He's published extensively on how different primate species move, how their skeletal structure determines gait patterns, how muscle groups coordinate during bipedal and quadrupedal movement. Dr. Thompson noticed something specific about the shoulder region. In the footage, the shoulders appear to move with some degree of independence from the torso. He explained to me that in actual primates, including humans, gorillas, and chimpanzees, the shoulder girdle, which includes the scapula and clavicle, integrates directly with the thoracic region through complex muscle and ligament connections. When a primate walks, even when walking upright on two legs as gorillas and chimps sometimes do, the shoulders and torso move as an integrated biomechanical unit. The movement pattern he observed in this footage suggested to him the possibility of externally attached costume components, shoulder pieces that aren't actually connected to the underlying skeletal structure the way real primate anatomy would be. Finally, I reached out to Dr. James Rodriguez, who spent 15 years working in the FBI's Video Analysis Unit. He's testified in federal court cases about video authenticity and digital forensics. I asked him to examine not just what the video shows, but what the file itself contains. Every digital video file contains metadata, hidden information embedded by the recording device, camera model, date, time, GPS coordinates if available, and importantly, sensor data. Dr. Rodriguez examined this metadata carefully. The video was recorded on an iPhone 12 Pro, which has sophisticated built-in image stabilization technology, but more significantly, the phone's internal sensors record acceleration and altitude data. This data showed something interesting. Throughout the entire recording, there was no altitude variation whatsoever. The phone maintained exactly the same elevation from start to finish. When someone holds a phone while walking or standing, even when trying to keep it steady, there's always some vertical movement, even just from breathing, from weight shifting, from natural body sway. The complete absence of altitude variation suggested to Dr. Rodriguez that the camera was mounted on a stable platform, most likely a tripod. His interpretation: this wasn't someone who spontaneously grabbed their phone upon seeing something unexpected. This appeared to be a carefully planned recording with the camera pre-positioned. 3 independent experts, 3 separate analytical approaches, 3 observations all pointing in a similar direction. The footage may not represent what it purports to be, a spontaneous wildlife encounter, and this raises questions about the financial success that followed its viral spread. And while this video accumulated millions of views, other evidence was being quietly documented elsewhere. November 12, 2021, 2:47 in the morning, Colville National Forest. In the northeast corner of Washington State, a wildlife biologist employed by the Washington Department of Natural Resources was conducting routine elk population surveys. This is standard work that happens every winter across public forest lands. The goal is to get accurate counts of elk herds to inform hunting quotas and habitat management decisions. For this particular survey, he was using thermal imaging equipment, not the consumer-grade thermals you might buy for a few $100s. These were professional FLIR systems, forward-looking infrared technology, the same type of equipment military and law enforcement use. Each unit costs approximately $12,000. They're sophisticated enough to distinguish between different species based on heat signature patterns, body proportions, and movement characteristics. The biologist, who I'll continue calling Mark since he requested anonymity in our conversations, he had positioned 6 cameras along known elk migration corridors. The cameras were set to activate on motion detection and record 30-second clips. This is standard protocol. You set them up at dusk, let them run all night, then collect data at dawn. At exactly 2:47 a.m., camera number 4 activated. When Mark reviewed the footage later that morning, he saw something he couldn't immediately explain. The thermal signature showed a bipedal figure, walking upright on 2 legs. Based on surrounding vegetation markers that he was familiar with from years working in that forest, he estimated the height at approximately 7.5 feet, possibly taller. But what made this observation particularly notable, at least from a biomechanical perspective, was the gait pattern. The figure appeared to walk with the knees remaining bent throughout the entire stride. This is something biomechanical specialists refer to as compliant gait. It's distinctly different from how humans typically walk. When we walk, we use what's called an inverted pendulum gait. Our legs swing forward relatively straight. The knee locks during the stance phase were essentially vaulting over each leg. This is energy efficient for bipedal humans. It's how our locomotion evolved. Gorillas and chimpanzees, when they walk upright, which they do occasionally, they use compliant gait. The knees stay bent throughout the entire stride. This requires constant quadriceps muscle engagement. It's physically exhausting. Most humans can't maintain this position for more than 20 or 30 seconds before muscle fatigue forces them to either straighten up or stop. The figure in Mark's thermal footage maintained compliant gait for the entire 30-second recording, covering approximately 40 to 45 feet of uneven terrain without any apparent difficulty or adjustment. Mark, being a trained wildlife biologist with 17 years of field experience, he's documented hundreds of animals on thermal imaging. He's seen black bears on thermal, including bears walking briefly on hind legs. He knows what bear locomotion looks like, the body proportions, the movement patterns, the heat signature distribution. This, according to his professional assessment, was not consistent with a bear. Following standard protocol, Mark filed a formal report through the Department of Natural Resources official channels. The report included the full footage, GPS coordinates of the camera location, timestamp, equipment specifications. His classification in the report was straightforward and factual. Unidentified large mammal, bipedal locomotion. He didn't claim to know what it was. He simply documented what the equipment captured. According to Mark's account of subsequent events, his supervisor contacted him the next day. There was, he says, a discussion about the classification. The suggestion was made that perhaps the observation should be reclassified, maybe as a black bear. Even though Mark's professional opinion was that it didn't match bear characteristics, Mark maintained his original assessment based on his training and experience. He felt that changing the classification would be scientifically inaccurate. Approximately 3 weeks later, Mark's contract came up for renewal, standard practice for many government wildlife positions. Their annual or biannual contracts. His contract was not renewed. He was told it was due to budgetary considerations and departmental restructuring. Mark shared his documentation with me, including the thermal footage, his original report, and internal email correspondence. He did this because, in his words, scientists have an obligation to report observations accurately, even when those observations are uncomfortable or difficult to categorize. A pattern emerges through investigation. Mark's case, as I mentioned, is not isolated. Over the course of my 20-year investigation, I've documented what I believe are similar patterns in over 40 cases. These are incidents where wildlife professionals, forest rangers, game wardens, search and rescue personnel filed official reports describing encounters with large bipedal animals that they couldn't identify, and subsequently experienced what might be described as professional complications, not always terminations. The pattern is more subtle than that. Sometimes it's contract non-renewals, as in Mark's case. Sometimes it's reassignments to different territories or different duties. Sometimes it's quiet suggestions from supervisors to modify report language. I should be clear. I'm not suggesting a coordinated conspiracy. What I'm observing appears to be more like institutional discomfort, a system that wasn't designed to process observations that don't fit into established taxonomic categories. Consider the practical implications from an institutional perspective. If a state wildlife agency were to officially recognize an unknown large primate living in public forests, the administrative and regulatory complications would be substantial. Every proposed timber harvest on federal lands would potentially require additional environmental assessment. If the animal is unknown to science, how do you assess environmental impact? Endangered species protections could theoretically apply, but how do you protect a species that isn't officially recognized? Land management decisions would face additional layers of scrutiny and potential legal challenge. Federal funding allocations could be affected. Grants might need restructuring. Public access policies to wilderness areas might require revision. And perhaps most significantly, tourism patterns would change dramatically. If any location becomes known as an area where these animals are officially documented, the influx of people seeking their own encounters could overwhelm local infrastructure. I'm not suggesting these concerns aren't legitimate. They are real administrative and practical challenges, but the result appears to be that unusual observations get documented through official channels, filed with vague classifications like unexplained wildlife activity. stored in databases where they're difficult to access for research purposes and rarely discussed publicly. Meanwhile, as I demonstrated earlier, the viral hoax videos with no scientific credibility continue to dominate public attention. This creates a significant problem for serious investigation of unexplained phenomena. The credible evidence is filed away and forgotten, while the fraudulent evidence spreads widely and shapes public perception. October 17, 2004, Mount Hood National Forest, Oregon. I was 28 years old at the time, working as a wildlife biologist for the United States Forest Service. It was my third year in that position. I was conducting what we call a black bear population survey. This is standard field work that wildlife biologists do. You hike established trails and game paths, document scat samples, look for claw marks on trees, note feeding patterns, set up trail cameras in strategic locations, collect GPS data. The goal is to get accurate population estimates to inform hunting quotas and habitat management. I was working solo that day, which is common for this type of survey. Mile marker 23 on the Timberline Trail. Elevation approximately 4,200 feet. Dense old-growth forest, primarily Douglas fir and western hemlock, the kind of forest where visibility is limited to maybe 30 or 40 feet in any direction. I'd been hiking and documenting for about 6 hours. It was mid-afternoon, probably around 3 o'clock. Good weather, clear skies, then something changed in the forest around me. The ambient sound just stopped, not gradually, but abruptly, like someone had flipped a switch. No bird calls, no wind through the branches, no small animals moving through undergrowth. Complete silence. Now, I need to explain something for those who don't spend extensive time in remote wilderness. Forests are rarely completely silent. There's almost always ambient sound. Wind, birds, insects, something. When a forest goes completely quiet like this, it usually means a large predator has moved through. Bears, cougars, sometimes even coyotes. Their presence causes other animals to go silent. It's a survival response. Stay quiet. Avoid detection. So when I noticed this silence, my training kicked in immediately. I stopped walking, stood completely still, listened carefully. That's when I heard something else. Breathing. Heavy, rhythmic, deliberate, coming from approximately 40 feet to my right, moving through dense understory vegetation. I've encountered dozens of black bears during my career. I know what they sound like. Their breathing, their movement patterns, the sounds they make pushing through brush. This sounded different to me. The breathing was slower, more measured, more controlled somehow. I turned very carefully and slowly toward the sound. Through gaps in the hemlock branches, I could see something, large, dark brown or black in color, upright, moving on 2 legs. I'm 6'2". This appeared significantly taller. I estimated 7.5 to 8 feet, broad across the shoulders. Long arms visible even through the vegetation. It was moving with clear purpose, not wandering, but moving in a deliberate direction. I observed it for approximately 10 seconds, maybe slightly longer. Then it moved behind a particularly dense cluster of trees, and I lost visual contact. No vocalization, no aggressive display, no dramatic moment. It simply moved out of my line of sight. My training as a biologist took over immediately. First rule: when you observe something unusual, investigate and document. I moved carefully to the area where I'd seen it. The ground in that section was relatively soft, combination of moss and decomposed organic material. I found what appeared to be impressions in this soft ground, partial tracks, not complete clear prints, but definite depressions. I measured them carefully using my field measuring tape, approximately 16 inches in length, about 7 inches wide at the widest point. The stride length, measuring from impression to impression, approximately 4.5 feet. I followed standard documentation protocol that we're trained to use, multiple photographs from different angles, measurements recorded in my field notebook. I collected soil samples from the impression areas for later analysis, documented GPS coordinates, noted time of day, weather conditions, temperature, photographed the surrounding vegetation, particularly areas where it appeared something large had pushed through. When I returned to the ranger station that evening, I reported my observations to my supervisor. His response, looking back, was educational in ways I didn't fully appreciate at the time. He didn't mock me, he didn't question my professional competence, but his body language and tone made something very clear. This was not the kind of observation that would enhance my career prospects. He suggested, in carefully chosen words, that it might have been a bear. I explained that I was familiar with bear behavior and appearance. This didn't match. He suggested perhaps the distance and vegetation had made identification difficult. I noted that visibility had been sufficient for observation. The conversation ended with a vague statement about being careful about how unusual observations are characterized in official reports. Later that evening, one of the senior rangers sought me out privately. He'd worked in these forests for over 30 years. He was someone I respected. He told me, and these weren't his exact words, but close to them, he'd had experiences too over his long career. Things he couldn't easily explain, things that didn't fit into the comfortable categories in our wildlife management manuals, but he'd learned that discussing these observations openly could affect how colleagues and supervisors viewed your professional judgment. That conversation fundamentally shaped my understanding of how institutional science sometimes handles anomalous observations. It's not malicious suppression necessarily. It's more like institutional discomfort with ambiguity and uncertainty, a preference for observations that fit established frameworks, and that preference, however unintentional, can discourage reporting of observations that challenge existing categories. October 20th, 1967, Bluff Creek, California. Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin filmed 59 seconds of footage. 57 years later, it remains unexplained by conventional analysis. Modern forensic examination has revealed interesting details. Dr. Jeff Meldrum, professor of anatomy at Idaho State University, he studied the visible foot mechanics in the footage. The foot appears to flex mid-stride in a way human feet typically don't. Human feet function as rigid levers for bipedal efficiency. Ape feet retain mid-tarsal flexibility for arboreal movement. The footage shows what appears to be this mid-tarsal break. According to Dr. Meldrum, if this is a costume, it would require prosthetic feet with non-human biomechanics, technology that wouldn't have been readily available in 1967. Dr. Grover Krantz analyzed the gait mechanics. Based on stride measurements and proportions, he estimated the subject's weight. His calculations suggested 500 to 800 pounds. A person in a costume would typically weigh much less. The mass-specific movement patterns are difficult to replicate artificially. Bill Munns, a professional costume designer with extensive Hollywood experience, he examined the surface details frame by frame. He identified what appears to be muscle movement beneath the surface, quadriceps appearing to contract during the walking motion. In his professional assessment, creating this effect in 1967 would have been technically challenging. 3 experts, independent analyses, similar observations. The footage shows something that's difficult to explain with known costume technology of that era. Not proof, certainly, but noteworthy that after 57 years, it remains unexplained. A common question: why haven't modern trail cameras and drones provided clear documentation? It's worth examining the practical challenges. The Pacific Northwest contains over 250,000 square miles of forest, much of it remote, difficult to access. Trying to document an elusive animal in this environment presents significant obstacles. Trail cameras have specific limitations. Detection range typically 30 to 50 feet. Battery life constrains continuous operation. They're usually positioned along established game trails. An intelligent animal could potentially learn to recognize and avoid them. We've documented this behavior in bears, wolves, even deer. Drones face different challenges. Dense forest canopy limits thermal imaging effectiveness. Battery life restricts flight duration. The search area is enormous. Finding a small, mobile population that may actively avoid detection, it's technically difficult. The technology helps, but it's not a simple solution. March 3, 2026, 3 weeks ago, Olympic National Forest, Washington, a Forest Service technician conducting spotted owl surveys, pre-dawn, 6:45 a.m., in remote old-growth forest. While setting up audio equipment, they heard movement, large, approximately 50 yards away, moving on 2 legs. Standard protocol: shut off equipment, remain still. The movement stopped. 3 minutes of silence. Then it resumed, passing within 30 feet, not clearly visible in the darkness. But the size was substantial. After it passed, they documented the location, GPS coordinates, time, conditions, then investigated the area, found partial impressions, approximately 16 inches long, photographed with agency equipment, full metadata, filed an official report, classified as unidentified large mammal. They contacted me because they wanted a scientific perspective, not for publicity. They specifically requested anonymity. Their assessment: they couldn't identify what they heard, but the movement pattern and stride length didn't match known species in that forest. That's what credible field observation sounds like. Uncertainty acknowledged, documentation thorough, no dramatic claims. After 20 years of investigation, several patterns emerge. Most public Bigfoot evidence appears to be unreliable: hoaxes, misidentifications, commercially motivated content. But a smaller percentage consists of observations from credible professionals, government thermal footage, official reports from forest personnel, documented encounters. This evidence deserves careful examination. Instead, it often gets filed quietly and rarely reviewed, not because of coordinated suppression, but because institutions lack frameworks for handling observations that don't fit established categories. Consider historical precedent. Mountain gorillas weren't scientifically documented until 1902. Giant squid were considered sailors' tales until the mid-1800s. The coelacanth was thought extinct until discovered in 1938. The saola, a large mammal, wasn't documented until 1992. Large animals can remain undocumented longer than we might expect. The Pacific Northwest contains vast remote wilderness. If a small population of intelligent, reclusive primates existed, would we necessarily have definitive proof? Not if they avoid human contact, not if institutional frameworks discourage reporting, not if professionals face career concerns for documenting unusual observations. Clear footage is often commercially motivated and unreliable. Lower quality documentation from official sources may be more significant because genuine evidence of elusive animals typically looks ambiguous, incomplete, frustrating, not cinematically satisfying. That's what real scientific mysteries look like. What troubles me most isn't whether these animals exist. It's that professionals who document unusual observations sometimes face career complications. That evidence gets filed away rather than investigated. That institutional frameworks seem inadequate for handling observations outside established categories. Next week, I'm analyzing 5 high-credibility cases in detail. Multiple professional witnesses, independent reports, physical documentation, cases where observers had professional reputations at stake. Subscribe to see that analysis.